Little girl whispered, "Stepmother, I can't see anymore." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, heavy with unspoken pain. Her simple confession would set off a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Rain pattered against the cracked glass of the manor window, creating a melancholy rhythm that matched the heaviness in 8-year-old Mary Smith's heart. The ancient estate creaked and sighed around her as she clung to the worn velvet arm of her chair, fingers tracing anxious patterns on the fabric. Her voice emerged barely louder than a whisper, fragile and frightened. "Stepmother, I can't see anymore." The words hung in the air of the dimly lit parlor, but Jennifer Smith, elegant in her navy dress that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the room, didn't even glance up from her afternoon tea. Steam rose from the delicate porcelain cup, curling into the space between them, like the silence that followed Mary's confession. Jennifer's indifference was as chilling as the storm that lashed against the windows of their rural English home. "Don't be silly," she finally replied, stirring another sugar cube into her cup with practiced precision. "You're simply tired from all that reading." But Mary knew this was different. The familiar outlines of the parlor, the heavy curtains, the portrait of her father above the fireplace, the collection of ornate music boxes her mother had cherished, were disappearing before her eyes. Her vision blurred, darkness blooming at the edges like spilled ink on parchment, until it gradually swallowed the room whole. She blinked rapidly, desperate to clear away the encroaching shadows. Her small hands trembled as she reached out, trying to orient herself in a world that was rapidly fading. Mary struggled to focus on anything: the pattern of the carpet, the shape of the lamp, even her stepmother's face, hoping to catch the smallest flicker of light. But it slipped away like water through cupped hands. The darkness left her in a silent void, more terrifying than any nightmare she'd ever experienced. The only sound that penetrated her new reality was the steady drip of water from the coat rack near the entrance, where the rain had soaked through her stepmother's umbrella. Each drop echoed her growing panic, tick, 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 like a countdown to something inevitable. "I'm really scared," Mary whispered, her voice catching. "Everything's gone dark." But Jennifer merely sighed, the rustle of her dress suggesting she had finally looked up from her tea. "You've always been imaginative, haven't you?" she said, her tone carrying a sharp edge beneath its practiced sweetness. "Perhaps you should rest upstairs until dinner." The child sat frozen, tears welling in eyes that could no longer see them fall, as the rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows of a house that had never truly felt like home. Jennifer Smith set her teacup down with a sharp clink against the saucer, the fine bone china quivering beneath her manicured fingers. The rain continued its relentless assault on the manor windows, creating a melancholy backdrop to the tension filling the parlor. "Don't be dramatic, Mary. You've always been imaginative," she said, annoyance flitting across her face. Her voice carried the practiced patience of someone addressing a particularly tiresome child. "This is just another one of your games to get attention." The stepmother smoothed the fabric of her navy dress, her wedding ring catching what little light filtered through the heavy curtains. She had been the lady of the estate for nearly 3 years now, and these theatrical displays from her late husband's daughter were becoming increasingly inconvenient. Mary's words hung in the air between them, unacknowledged and dismissed. The little girl's fingers gripped the worn arm of her chair as the room began to spin around her. The familiar outlines of the parlor furniture, the mahogany sideboard, the grandfather clock in the corner, the portrait of her father above the fireplace, all blurred into indistinguishable shapes before fading into shadow. Her stepmother's words stung more than her fading sight, each syllable a reminder of how unseen she truly was in this household. Even before her vision began to fail, Mary had felt invisible, a ghost haunting the corridors of what had once been her home. As panic threatened to overwhelm her, Mary's trembling fingers began to trace patterns on her skirt, conjuring stories from memory. Under her touch, the fabric transformed, becoming rolling meadows where magical creatures played, towering castles where brave knights defended princesses, and endless oceans where mermaids sang beneath starlit skies. "I'll check on dinner," Jennifer announced, rising from her seat with fluid grace. She paused at the doorway, glancing back at the small figure huddled in the armchair. For a moment, something like concern flickered across her features, quickly replaced by her usual mask of indifference. "Sarah will be in shortly to help you upstairs. Try not to bump into anything." Left alone, Mary continued weaving her silent tales. If she could not see the world as it was, she would invent one, bright enough to guide her through the darkness. In her mind's eye, she pictured her mother's music box, tucked away in the attic, where her stepmother couldn't find it. The memory of its melody offered more comfort than any words Jennifer might have spoken. Outside, the storm intensified, and somewhere in the distance, a carriage approached the estate, its wheels cutting through mud and memory alike. The ancient oak door of the manor groaned on its hinges, the sound reverberating through the parlor like a warning. A gust of rain-scented air swept in, extinguishing one of the candles and causing the shadows to dance wildly across the faded wallpaper. Mary Smith turned her head toward the sound, her unseeing eyes wide with apprehension. John Brown stood in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the stormy afternoon sky. Rainwater dripped from his wool coat onto the polished floor, forming small puddles that reflected the dim chandelier light. His presence immediately altered the atmosphere of the room, as if the air itself recognized his authority. "I do apologize for the intrusion," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of education and wealth. He removed his sodden hat, revealing silver-streaked dark hair. "The weather has been most uncooperative." The butler hurried forward to take his coat, but John waved him away, his attention fixed on the small figure huddled in the armchair. He crossed the parlor with measured steps, his expensive leather shoes leaving damp imprints on the Persian rug. Jennifer Smith rose from her seat, her teacup clattering against its saucer. "I'm afraid we weren't expecting visitors today," she said, her voice brittle with forced politeness, "particularly not in such dreadful weather." The millionaire ignored her, kneeling instead before Mary's chair. He studied the child's face, the unfocused eyes, the pallor of her skin, the slight tremble of her lower lip. Something in his expression softened, a flicker of recognition and resolve. "Hello, Mary," he said gently. "I knew your mother very well." The girl's fingers tightened on the armrest, her head tilting slightly as she tried to locate the source of his voice. "You knew my mother?" she whispered. Jennifer stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her stepdaughter's shoulder that seemed more possessive than comforting. "Mr. Brown, I presume? Whatever business you had with Elizabeth is in the past. My husband's daughter is under my care now." John rose to his full height, towering over Jennifer. His eyes, sharp as flint, never left Mary's face as he spoke. "I've come for her." The words hung in the air like the last note of a funeral dirge. Sarah Davis, who had been dusting in the corner, froze mid-motion. The butler at the door inhaled sharply. Even the grandfather clock seemed to hesitate between ticks. Jennifer's teacup rattled dangerously in her grasp, tea sloshing over the rim onto her navy dress. "I beg your pardon?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've come for Mary," John repeated, each word measured and immovable as stone. "And I intend to fulfill the promise I made to her mother." John Brown stood in the doorway, rainwater pooling at his feet on the expensive Persian rug. The millionaire's reputation for eccentricity preceded him throughout the county, but there was nothing eccentric about his demeanor now, only purpose. His keen eyes swept across the ornate parlor, taking in the antique furniture, the crackling fireplace, and finally settling on the small figure huddled in the oversized armchair. "Mr. Brown," Jennifer Smith said, her voice betraying a slight tremor despite her composed exterior. What an unexpected pleasure! He didn't acknowledge her greeting. The staff hovering at the edges of the room exchanged nervous glances, but John paid them no mind. The icy glare from Mary's stepmother bounced off him like the raindrops from his wool coat. "I've come about Mary," he announced, stepping further into the room. His shoes left damp impressions on the carpet as he moved toward the child. "Her mother trusted me. I made a promise I intend to keep." Jennifer set down her teacup with deliberate care, the porcelain making a sharp sound against its saucer. "I'm afraid I don't understand. What business could you possibly have with my stepdaughter?" "I was Elizabeth's closest friend," he replied, using Mary's mother's name like a key unlocking a forbidden door. "Before she passed, she made arrangements." Mary's small fingers tightened around the worn fabric of her chair. Though her eyes stared vacantly ahead, her head tilted slightly toward the sound of his voice. For the first time in months, something stirred within her, a fragile, flickering thing she had almost forgotten. Hope. Jennifer rose from her seat, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her navy dress. "You must be mistaken, Mr. Brown. Mary is perfectly fine, as you can see." She gestured toward the child with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're managing quite well." "Are you?" John asked quietly, his gaze never leaving Mary. He knelt before her chair, bringing himself to her level. "Hello, Mary. Do you remember me? I visited when you were younger. I brought you a music box that played your favorite lullaby." A faint recognition crossed Mary's face. Her lips parted slightly, and she nodded. "This is absurd," Jennifer interjected. "You cannot simply walk into our home and—" "I can and I will," John interrupted, his voice soft but unyielding. "I've been watching from a distance far too long. Something isn't right here, and I intend to discover what it is." Mary's hand moved tentatively forward, reaching into the darkness until her fingers found the rough wool of his coat sleeve. The contact seemed to anchor her, and the smallest of smiles ghosted across her face. That night, Mary Smith lay awake in her bed, listening to the storm outside gradually subside. The rain, which had been pounding against her window for hours, softened to a gentle patter. Moonlight occasionally broke through the clouds, casting fleeting shadows across her bedroom walls. Despite the late hour, sleep eluded the 8-year-old, her mind racing with thoughts of the strange man who had appeared at the manor earlier that day. Beneath her pillow, Mary clutched a small, battered notebook, her most treasured possession. With trembling fingers, she pulled it out and opened it carefully. Though she could no longer see the pages clearly, her muscle memory guided her hand as she began to draw. The young girl filled the pages with images from stories her mother had told her before she passed. Magnificent gardens bursting with spring flowers, bustling city streets filled with horse-drawn carriages and automobiles, vast oceans stretching to the horizon that she had never witnessed firsthand. "I'll remember them all," she whispered to herself, pressing the pencil firmly against the paper. "Even if I can't see them anymore." The floorboards outside her room creaked softly. Mary quickly tucked the notebook away, recognizing the familiar, gentle footsteps of Sarah Davis. The loyal housemaid pushed the door open with her shoulder, carefully balancing a tray with a steaming cup. "I thought you might still be awake," Sarah said softly, setting the tray on the bedside table. The comforting aroma of warm milk with a hint of honey filled the room. "The storm always keeps you up, doesn't it?" Mary nodded, her hands reaching out instinctively. Sarah guided the child's fingers to the cup, making sure her grip was secure before letting go. "Miss Jennifer doesn't know I'm here," the housemaid confided, perching on the edge of the bed. Her apron rustled as she smoothed Mary's tangled hair away from her face. "She'd have my position if she knew I was disturbing you after bedtime." The child sipped the warm milk slowly, drawing comfort from both the drink and the maid's presence. In the vast manor, Sarah was her only true ally, the only one who treated her with genuine kindness since her vision had begun to fade. "That man today," Mary whispered. "Do you know who he is?" Sarah hesitated, glancing toward the door before leaning closer. "Mr. Brown is a complicated man with a good heart, that's all I know." She tucked the blankets around the child's small frame. "You're not alone, Mary," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's more to you than they want to see." As Sarah quietly slipped from the room, Mary clutched her notebook once more, a tiny spark of hope kindling in her heart. The next morning, Mary Smith woke to the sound of rain still drumming against the manor's windows. Her small fingers traced the edge of her bed, finding the familiar worn spot that helped her orient herself each day. The darkness that had swallowed her world remained, but something inside her had shifted. A tiny spark of determination had ignited. With careful movements, Mary slid from her bed and felt for her slippers. She had memorized the number of steps to her door, to the hallway, to the grand staircase. But today, she wasn't heading downstairs. Instead, she turned toward the narrow servants' staircase that led to the attic, a place she'd visited often before losing her sight. As she hesitated at the bottom step, a gentle hand touched her shoulder. "Miss Mary, what are you doing out of bed so early?" It was Sarah Davis, her voice soft with concern. "I need to go to the attic," the child whispered. "There's something I need to find." The housemaid hesitated, glancing nervously toward Jennifer's quarters. "Your stepmother wouldn't approve of you wandering about." But seeing the determination on the little girl's face, Sarah sighed. "Hold on to my apron, I'll guide you." Mary's fingers clutched the fabric, taking comfort in the faint scent of lavender that always clung to the maid's clothes. Together, they ascended the creaking stairs, Sarah whispering warnings about loose boards and low beams. The attic air was thick with dust and memories. Mary breathed deeply, letting her other senses compensate for her lost sight. Her fingers trailed along forgotten furniture, seeking something she couldn't name, but somehow knew was waiting. "Over here." Sarah guided her to a corner where her mother's belongings had been hastily stored after her passing. "What are you looking for, dear?" Mary's hands moved with surprising certainty, as if drawn by an invisible thread. They found a small wooden box, intricately carved. "This," she whispered. When she lifted the lid, a delicate melody filled the attic, notes that transported her instantly to evenings in her mother's arms. "She used to sing this to me," Mary murmured, tears welling in her sightless eyes. Her fingers explored the music box's interior, discovering a hidden compartment. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, its edges worn soft with age. "What does it say?" she asked, holding it toward Sarah. The maid unfolded it carefully. "When the world grows dark, a guardian will come. Trust the voice of the storm." Mary's heart pounded against her ribs. The millionaire had arrived during the storm, just as the note had predicted. She clutched the paper to her chest, this tangible connection to her mother, feeling like a lifeline thrown into her sea of darkness. "We should go," Sarah whispered urgently. "Your stepmother will be looking for you." But Mary barely heard her. For the first time since losing her sight, she felt something powerful growing within her. Hope. John Brown returned to the manor 3 days later, carrying a leather portfolio and presenting himself at the door with the practiced smile of an art appraiser. Jennifer Smith greeted him with thinly veiled suspicion, her elegant posture rigid as she led him through the grand hallway. "These portraits are quite remarkable," he commented, adjusting his spectacles while examining a dusty painting of a stern-faced ancestor. His words were meant for Jennifer, but his attention kept drifting to Mary, who moved cautiously along the corridor, her small hand trailing against the wallpaper for guidance. The millionaire watched how the child navigated her familiar prison. Though her eyes stared vacantly, her other senses seemed heightened. Pausing when floorboards creaked, tilting her head at distant sounds, her fingers reading the texture of surfaces like braille. She was adapting, but the darkness was consuming her world piece by piece. "This landscape might fetch a handsome sum at auction," John remarked to Jennifer, who nodded with calculated interest. When the stepmother excused herself to fetch tea, He seized the opportunity. "Mary," he called softly. The girl froze, then turned toward his voice with uncanny precision. "You're the man from before," she whispered, recognition in her voice despite her blindness. "I am. Would you show me the greenhouse? I hear it has remarkable architecture." Mary hesitated, then nodded, leading him with surprising confidence through a side door and down a gravel path. The greenhouse stood at the edge of the garden, its glass panels clouded with years of neglect. Inside, the air hung heavy with moisture and the earthy perfume of soil and vegetation. Forgotten plants stretched toward light, wild and untamed in their abandonment. "I come here to be alone," Mary confessed, navigating between overgrown ferns and trailing vines. "Sarah, our housemaid, she's the only one who knows." John closed the door behind them, ensuring their privacy. Sunlight filtered through the dirty glass, casting dappled patterns across the stone floor. He knelt before the child, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your mother was my friend, Mary. We studied together, dreamed together." His words carried the weight of memory. "I've come to help you, but you must trust me." The girl's face betrayed a complex battle, hope warring with the caution of a child who had learned that adults rarely kept their promises. Her fingers twisted nervously in the fabric of her dress. "Did you know her well, my mother?" she asked, vulnerability cracking through her carefully constructed walls. "Well enough to promise her I would watch over you," he answered, "and well enough to know that what's happening to you isn't what she would have wanted." Mary stood perfectly still, torn between fear and longing, between the darkness she knew and the uncertain light this stranger offered. Outside, clouds gathered over the English countryside, casting the greenhouse in deeper shadow. The greenhouse glass panels filtered the afternoon light into a kaleidoscope of patterns across the worn wooden floor. John Brown had transformed this neglected space into something between a laboratory and a sanctuary. Potted plants lined the perimeter, their earthy fragrance mingling with the clinical scent of the equipment he'd carefully arranged on a folding table. "We'll start with something simple," John explained, his voice gentle as he guided Mary Smith to a stool. "Close your eyes. Not that it makes much difference now, but I want you to focus entirely on your other senses." Their sessions began in secret. Jennifer would be furious if she discovered what they were doing, but John was determined to honor his promise to Mary's mother. He placed the pocket watch in Mary's small palm, its metal case still warm from his pocket. "This belonged to your mother," he said, watching the girl's fingers trace the intricate engravings. "Listen to its rhythm. Let it anchor you when you feel lost." The steady tick-tick-tick became Mary's compass. John would move around the greenhouse, asking her to point toward the sound of his voice, then his footsteps, then the rustle of leaves as he brushed against plants. At first, she failed more than she succeeded, frustration etching lines on her young face. "I can't do it," she whispered one day, tears welling in her sightless eyes. "You can," John insisted. "Your world isn't shrinking, Mary. It's transforming." He introduced new exercises, identifying flowers by scent, distinguishing between the textures of different leaves, navigating obstacles by the subtle changes in air currents against her skin. The millionaire's patience never wavered, even when Mary stumbled or knocked things over. In the corner of the greenhouse stood an old upright piano, rescued from a forgotten parlor. Its ivory keys were yellowed with age, but the sound remained true. John guided Mary's fingers to the keyboard. "Music doesn't require sight," he told her. "It speaks directly to the soul." Mary's first attempts were hesitant, discordant. But as days turned to weeks, she began to compose simple melodies, haunting little tunes that seemed to capture her journey through darkness. When words failed her, when the frustration of her condition became overwhelming, she would retreat to the piano, letting her fingers speak what her voice could not. Her world expanded in unexpected ways. Though her vision continued to dim, her other senses sharpened remarkably. She could identify Sarah's approach, by the distinctive pattern of her footsteps, or detect when Michael had been riding by the faint scent of horses that clung to his clothes. "You're learning to see without eyes," John told her one evening as they concluded their session. "And that, my dear, is something truly extraordinary." Jennifer Smith had grown increasingly wary of the secretive meetings between her stepdaughter and John Browd. The millionaire's frequent visits to the estate under the pretense of appraising artwork no longer convinced her. Something deeper was happening, and Jennifer was determined to uncover it. One evening, as dusk settled over the manor grounds, Jennifer noticed Mary's absence from dinner. Slipping on her coat, she followed the faint sound of voices drifting from the greenhouse. Her expensive heels sank into the rain-softened earth as she approached, forcing her to tread carefully to avoid detection. The greenhouse glowed with soft lamplight, casting long shadows across the overgrown garden. Jennifer positioned herself behind a cluster of untrimmed shrubs, close enough to hear the conversation within. Through the fogged glass, she could make out John's tall figure gesturing animatedly while Mary sat attentively on a wooden stool. "The treatment is experimental but promising," John explained, his voice carrying through a partially open window. "Your mother believed it could work. That's why she contacted me before." Jennifer's breath caught. Her suspicions crystallized into certainty as she listened to John describe techniques for neural stimulation and vision restoration. This wasn't mere kindness. He was actively working to undermine her authority, perhaps even expose her role in concealing Mary's true condition. The stepmother slipped away before being discovered, her mind racing with plans. She couldn't allow this interference to continue. The estate and Mary's inheritance were too valuable to relinquish. The following night, Jennifer waited until the household was asleep. With practiced stealth, she made her way to the greenhouse, unlocking the door with the master key she kept hidden in her jewelry box. Inside, John's makeshift laboratory was neatly arranged: vials of solutions, delicate instruments, and a journal filled with detailed notes about Mary's progress. Without hesitation, Jennifer began her sabotage. She emptied precious solutions down the drain, crossed wires in the small electrical apparatus John had assembled, and deliberately misplaced critical components. Her fingers worked methodically, erasing weeks of careful preparation in minutes. The next morning, Mary felt her way to the greenhouse, excited for her session with John. Instead, she found her godfather standing amidst the chaos, his usually composed voice tight with controlled anger. "Someone's been here," he said as Mary's fingers brushed against empty spaces where equipment had been carefully arranged. The young girl's heart sank. "Can we fix it?" she asked, her voice small against the enormity of the destruction. John placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It will take time," he admitted, "but I won't give up." Mary nodded bravely, though inside, the fragile hope she'd been nurturing flickered dangerously, threatened by this new obstacle in her path toward light. The stables offered Mary Smith a refuge from the suffocating atmosphere of the manor. Every afternoon, when Jennifer was occupied with her social calls, Mary would carefully make her way along the path she had memorized, counting steps until she reached the familiar scent of hay and horses. "You should have seen the ribbons at the fair yesterday," Michael Johnson said, his voice animated as he guided Mary's hand to brush the mane of a gentle mare. "They were hanging everywhere, red, blue, and yellow ones dancing in the breeze like they were alive." The 12-year-old stable boy had become Mary's window to the world beyond the estate walls. While her sight had faded to darkness, Michael's vivid descriptions painted pictures more colorful than any she had known before. "And the music?" Mary asked eagerly, leaning against a wooden post. "Oh, there was a man with an accordion who played so fast his fingers were just a blur," Michael replied, demonstrating with a flurry of movement against Mary's palm. "And people were dancing in circles, laughing so loud you could hear them from the edge of the village." Mary closed her unseeing eyes, absorbing every detail. In her mind, she could almost hear the accordion's cheerful notes, and feel the vibration of stomping feet on packed earth. "I'll take you there someday," Michael promised, his voice dropping to a whisper. "When I'm older, I'll save enough to buy us train tickets to London." The stable boy often spoke of escape, of leaving behind the endless chores and stern reprimands from the head groom. He dreamed of adventures in the city, of finding work that didn't leave his hands raw and his back aching. "But what about Jennifer?" Mary asked, her face clouding with worry. Michael scoffed. "Your stepmother wouldn't even notice for days." Together, they had developed a secret language of small rebellions. Mary would smuggle sweet biscuits from the kitchen, wrapped in handkerchiefs and hidden in her pockets. Michael would leave wildflowers on the windowsill of her bedroom, arranged in patterns she could identify by touch. Their greatest accomplishment was carved into the ancient oak behind the stables. Their initials, M&M, etched with Michael's pocketknife. Mary had guided his hand, feeling the rough bark beneath her fingertips as they created something permanent in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. One day, Michael said, pressing a small object into Mary's palm, a wooden horse he'd carved himself, "Things will be different for both of us." Mary nodded, clutching the tiny sculpture. In a manner full of expensive trinkets, this rough-hewn token of friendship was her most precious possession. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the leaded glass windows of the manor's east wing, casting golden patterns across the floor. Mary Smith sat at a small wooden table, her fingers moving with unexpected confidence across a sheet of paper. John Brown observed her from across the room, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you drawing today?" he asked, moving closer. Mary's hand never faltered. "A garden with stone archways and a fountain shaped like a dolphin," she replied, her voice dreamy. "The water sparkles when the sun hits it just right." John picked up one of her completed sketches, a detailed rendering of a coastal town with narrow streets climbing up a hillside. The precision was remarkable, especially for a child who could no longer see. Next to it lay another drawing of a bustling marketplace with ornate architecture that appeared distinctly Mediterranean. "These places," he said carefully, "have you visited them before?" Mary shook her head. "They're from the note in the attic, the one that talks about the guardian." The millionaire's pulse quickened. He spread the drawings across the table, comparing them to the vague descriptions in the cryptic note they'd found weeks earlier. The correlation was undeniable, yet far too detailed to come from the sparse text alone. "Your mother," he ventured, "did she ever speak of traveling to these places?" The child paused, her pencil hovering above the paper. "She used to tell me bedtime stories about her adventures before I was born, about gardens where fountains danced and cities built on water." John's mind raced. Elizabeth Smith, Mary's mother, had indeed traveled extensively before her marriage. These weren't random imaginings. They were memories preserved in the stories shared between mother and daughter. "I think," he said gently, "that your mind remembers more than you realize." He knelt beside her chair, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Mary, I'm beginning to believe that not all of your blindness is physical. The trauma of losing your mother, the accident afterward, sometimes our minds protect us by closing certain doors." The girl's fingers trembled slightly. "You mean I might see again?" "I don't want to promise anything," he cautioned, remembering all too well the patient he'd failed years ago. "But these drawings suggest your visual memory is intact. Your mind still knows how to see." Mary reached out, finding his hand with surprising accuracy. "Mother always said that seeing happens in the heart first." John squeezed her small fingers, emotion tightening his throat. The experimental treatments he'd been developing might address physical damage, but this revelation suggested a different approach entirely. If Mary's blindness was partly psychological, a response to trauma and secrets, then healing might require uncovering the truth about what really happened the day her world went dark. He glanced toward the door, suddenly aware they might be overheard. Jennifer Smith would not take kindly to these developments. Not kindly at all. The village fair was a rare indulgence that John Brown had insisted upon, arguing that Mary Smith needed experiences beyond the confining walls of the estate. Jennifer Smith had reluctantly agreed, though she'd made her displeasure known through pursed lips and clipped words. As they entered the fairgrounds, Mary was immediately engulfed by a symphony of unfamiliar sensations. The cacophony of laughter and chatter pressed against her ears, while the mingling aromas of sugared treats, hay, and livestock created an invisible map she struggled to navigate. Her small hand gripped Michael Johnson's with increasing urgency. "It's too much," she whispered, her face tilted downward as if the gesture might somehow shield her from the overwhelming assault. The stable boy squeezed her fingers reassuringly. "I've got you," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the swirling chaos. "Let me describe everything." Michael guided her through the fairgrounds with patient devotion, transforming the invisible world into vivid pictures through his words. He described the colorful ribbons fluttering from tent poles, the jugglers tossing bowls that seemed to defy gravity, and the faces of villagers who smiled curiously at the little girl from the manor. "There's music coming from the center stage," he told her, gently steering her toward the sound. They found seats on a wooden bench as a troupe of traveling singers began their performance. The lead vocalist, a woman with a crystalline voice, began a haunting melody that seemed to pierce through Mary's darkness. The notes hung in the air like delicate glass ornaments, fragile and perfect. Without warning, memories flooded Mary's mind, her mother singing this very lullaby while brushing her hair, the warmth of being tucked into bed with a kiss on her forehead, the sound of her mother's laughter as they chased butterflies in the garden. These fragments, preserved like pressed flowers in the pages of her mind, suddenly bloomed with vivid clarity. Tears slipped down Mary's cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. These weren't tears of sorrow, but of recognition, each drop an acknowledgement of the love she carried within her, even in darkness. "She used to sing this to me," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible above the music. "I'd forgotten until now." Michael remained silent, understanding that some moments needed no response. When the song ended, Mary squeezed his hand with newfound strength. "Thank you for being my eyes today," she said, a small smile forming on her lips. "Even without seeing, I feel less alone when you're here." The bittersweet realization settled over her like a familiar blanket, that even in her darkened world, she had been collecting and preserving fragments of light all along. John Brown stood in Jennifer Smith's study, his heart pounding as he stared at the bundle of letters in his trembling hands. He'd discovered them purely by accident, hidden behind a false panel in her mahogany desk while searching for estate documents. The faded envelopes bore the elegant handwriting of Mary's mother, correspondence she'd written in her final months. The millionaire sank into the leather chair, adjusting his reading glasses as he scanned page after page. Each letter revealed a darker truth than the last. Mary's condition wasn't simply a sudden onset of blindness. It was a rare, potentially treatable neurological disorder that Jennifer had deliberately concealed. The girl's mother had arranged for specialized care before her death, entrusting funds specifically for Mary's treatment. "My God," he whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. Jennifer had diverted those funds, dismissing the specialists and isolating Mary to maintain control of the estate. The final letter was the most damning, a desperate plea to John himself, naming him as Mary's godfather and legal guardian should anything happen to her. The door creaked open. Jennifer stood framed in the doorway, her face draining of color as she recognized what John held. "Those are private," she said, her voice brittle as she stepped forward. "You have no right." John rose slowly, tucking the letters into his coat pocket. "I have every right. Her mother made me Mary's guardian, something you conveniently forgot to mention. You abandoned her for years, Jennifer countered, advancing into the room. Where were you when she needed you? I never knew she needed me, he replied, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. You made certain of that. The stepmother's composure cracked. You're meddling in affairs you don't understand. This estate, this family. This isn't about the estate, John interrupted. It's about a little girl who's been denied proper care while you squandered her inheritance. Jennifer's eyes narrowed dangerously. Get out. You have no legal standing here. These letters say otherwise. He patted his pocket. Mary's condition can be treated. The specialists her mother arranged. Those quacks, she spat, with their experimental treatments and false promises. John stepped closer, his voice dropping to a determined whisper. I'm taking these letters to my solicitor tomorrow. I will fight for Mary with everything I have. Jennifer's laugh was cold. You'll lose. Perhaps, he conceded, but I promise you this. I will protect that child, no matter the cost. He moved toward the door, pausing only to add, her mother would have expected nothing less. The acrid smell of smoke was the first warning. Mary Smith had been sitting in the parlor, her fingers tracing patterns on her notebook when she detected it. A bitter tang that didn't belong among the usual manner scents. The greenhouse was burning. Fire! Michael's panicked voice echoed through the corridors as he burst through the door. The greenhouse is on fire, and Sarah's trapped inside. Jennifer Smith rose from her chair, her teacup clattering to the floor. Someone call for help, she commanded, but remained rooted in place, her face a mask of controlled alarm. John Brown was already running toward the blaze, his coat abandoned on the floor. Mary, stay here where it's safe, he called over his shoulder. But Mary knew something the others didn't. The greenhouse had a hidden door that led to a storage room, a secret Sarah had once shared with her. If the main entrance was blocked, Sarah would be trapped with no way out. Without hesitation, Mary rose to her feet. The manor was her world, mapped in her mind through countless hours of careful exploration. She knew every creaking floorboard, every draft, every turn of the corridor. Mary, what are you doing? Jennifer's voice held genuine fear as the child moved with surprising confidence toward the east wing. Mary ignored her stepmother, counting her steps, her hand trailing along the wall. 23 steps to the corridor junction, 12 more to the servants' passage. The smoke grew thicker, burning her lungs, but she pressed on. Outside, the greenhouse glowed orange against the evening sky. Flames licked at the glass panels, shattering them with explosive pops. John's prototype device, months of painstaking work designed to help restore Mary's sight, was already consumed by the inferno. Sarah, Mary called, her voice barely audible above the roar of the fire. She found the hidden door by memory alone, her fingers locating the concealed latch exactly where it should be. Inside, Sarah Davis lay unconscious, overcome by smoke. Mary dropped to her knees, shaking the maid's shoulder. We have to go, she whispered, tugging at Sarah's apron. The journey back was a nightmare of heat and confusion. Mary crawled, pulling Sarah behind her, guided only by the sound of distant voices and the feel of the floor beneath her hands. When they emerged from the servants' entrance, coughing and covered in soot, a stunned silence fell over the gathered crowd. My God, John whispered, rushing forward to help them both. Jennifer stood frozen, her perfectly composed facade crumbling, as she watched the child she had dismissed as helpless save a life through sheer determination. For the first time, a flicker of something like respect, perhaps even shame, crossed her face. Mary sat on the damp grass, her lungs burning, but her spirit soaring. In the darkness that had become her world, she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. The winter months passed slowly at the manor, each day bringing new challenges for Mary Smith. The treatments John Brown had developed grew more intense, pushing the limits of what the 8-year-old could endure. 3 times a week, they would meet in what remained of the greenhouse, its charred beams now reinforced with new wood that still smelled of pine and possibility. "Focus on the sound," John instructed, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The pocket watch that had belonged to Mary's mother ticked rhythmically as he moved it around her. "Tell me where it is without reaching." Mary's concentration was absolute, her small face tightening with effort. When the seizures came, violent tremors that left her exhausted, she would bite her lip until Sarah Davis found her afterward, dabbing away tiny spots of blood with a damp cloth. "You're the bravest girl I've ever known," the housemaid would whisper, brushing Mary's hair with gentle strokes. One particularly difficult afternoon, after Mary had collapsed from the strain of a new sensory exercise, John retreated to the parlor, his shoulders heavy with doubt. The millionaire stared into the fireplace, memories of another child, a boy in Liverpool whose treatments had failed catastrophically, haunting him like ghosts in the flames. "Perhaps we should stop," he murmured when Sarah brought him tea. "I've pushed her too far." But that evening, Mary appeared at his door, guided by Michael Johnson's careful descriptions of the corridors, turns, and steps. "I heard you talking to Sarah," she said, her voice small but determined. "Please don't give up on me." The stable boy squeezed her hand before slipping away, leaving godfather and goddaughter alone. "Catherine, your mother, believed in impossible things," John said after a long silence. "She saw light where others saw only darkness." Mary's fingers found the edge of his desk, tracing the wood grain. "Then I'm my mother's daughter," she replied, "because even though I can't see it, I know the light is still there." Her quiet courage pierced through John's hesitation. The next morning, he modified his approach, incorporating music into their sessions. The old piano in the East Wing became their sanctuary, Mary's fingers finding melodies that seemed to unlock memories buried deep within her mind. Jennifer Smith watched from doorways, her elegant features hardening each time she witnessed the growing bond between her stepdaughter and the eccentric millionaire. But even her cold presence couldn't diminish the determination that now radiated from Mary, a girl who, despite living in darkness, somehow managed to illuminate everyone around her. Together, they pushed forward, one painful step after another, toward the light that had once filled Mary's world, and might, against all odds, find its way back. Sarah Davis slipped quietly through the manor's dimly lit corridors, a folded note tucked inside her apron pocket. The housemaid had become adept at moving undetected, especially when Jennifer Smith was entertaining guests in the parlor. Tonight was no exception. She found Mary sitting by the window in her bedroom, fingers tracing patterns on the glass. "It's from Michael," Sarah whispered, pressing the note into Mary's small hand. "He's gathered information about John's new treatment plan." Mary's face brightened. At 9 years old, she had developed an intricate network of allies within the very walls meant to confine her. The stable boy had become her eyes beyond the estate, while Sarah provided protection within it. "Jennifer's been meeting with Lord Harrington again," Sarah continued, straightening the bed covers. "He arrived in that fancy automobile of his, the one that makes Michael so envious." Mary nodded, her expression darkening. Lord Harrington, a wealthy widower in his 50s, had been visiting with increasing frequency. His booming laugh echoed through the manor, followed always by Jennifer's calculated giggles. That evening, Michael Johnson crept to Mary's window, tapping their secret code against the glass. Despite being only 12, the stable boy had mastered the art of climbing the ancient oak that reached toward Mary's room. "Your stepmother's planning something," he whispered after Mary opened the window. "I overheard her telling Lord Harrington that you'd make a perfect daughter-in-law for his family someday." "His son's 16, Mary." The realization hit her like cold water. Jennifer wasn't merely entertaining a suitor for herself. She was negotiating Mary's future, attempting to secure her position through marriage arrangements that would keep her connected to the estate's wealth. The next morning at breakfast, Jennifer announced brightly, "The Harringtons have invited us for tea tomorrow. Lord Harrington's son is quite accomplished for his age." Mary set down her spoon with deliberate slowness. "I won't be going," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jennifer's teacup froze midway to her lips. "I beg your pardon?" "I said I won't be going." Mary raised her chin slightly. "And I won't be meeting any potential husbands. I'm 9 years old." The stepmother's face flushed crimson. This childish defiance must stop. "You have responsibilities to this estate." "My responsibility is to my mother's memory," Mary interrupted, "not to your schemes." Jennifer slammed her cup down, tea splashing onto the tablecloth. "You forget yourself, child. While you live under my roof, it's my roof," Mary said simply, "and one day I'll decide who stays beneath it." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of war whispered in a child's voice. The frost that had gripped the countryside for months finally surrendered to the gentle warmth of spring. Throughout the grounds of the Smith estate, daffodils pushed through the soil and cherry blossoms dusted the pathways with delicate pink petals. Mary Smith could not see the transformation, but she felt it in every other way. The softness of the breeze against her face, the chorus of birdsong that woke her each morning, and the earthy scent of renewal that permeated the air. "The primroses are blooming by the south wall," Michael Johnson told her as they sat beneath the old oak tree. The stable boy had become her eyes to the world, describing everything in vivid detail. "And the gardeners have planted tulips in your favorite colors, red and yellow." Mary smiled, running her fingers along the rough bark where they had carved their initials. "It feels different here now," she said, "like the house is breathing again." Inside the manor, Sarah Davis noticed the change too. The housemaid hummed as she polished the banister, watching Mary navigate the corridors with increasing confidence. Even John Brown remarked on the transformation when he visited, noting how the girl's steps were surer, her laughter more frequent. Only Jennifer Smith remained untouched by the season's promise. The stepmother grew more agitated as preparations for the annual spring gala consumed the household. This gathering of local nobility and gentry had always been her moment to shine, to cement her position in society. "Mary will remain upstairs during the event," Jennifer instructed Sarah, adjusting her pearl necklace in the hallway mirror. "I won't have her stumbling about, embarrassing us all." But when the night of the gala arrived, Mary appeared at the top of the grand staircase. She wore a simple blue dress that Sarah had secretly altered, her hair arranged with fresh flowers. The girl descended slowly, one hand trailing the banister, the other clutching her mother's pocket watch. Jennifer froze mid-conversation, her champagne glass nearly slipping from her fingers. "What are you doing?" she hissed when Mary reached the bottom step. The music faltered. Conversations died. In the sudden silence, Mary turned toward her stepmother's voice. "I belong here too," she said, her voice small but clear. "I am not invisible. I am not weak." A murmur rippled through the crowd. These people had watched Mary grow up, had whispered about her condition, had pitied her from a distance, but they had never truly seen her until this moment. Standing tall despite her blindness, courage emanating from her like light. John Brown, watching from across the room, couldn't suppress a smile of pride. The girl who had once clung to shadows was stepping into her own power, and not even Jennifer Smith could dim that transformation. The consequences of Mary's public stand were immediate and severe. Sarah Davis was dismissed the very next morning, her few belongings hastily packed, as Jennifer Smith stood watching, arms crossed and expression unforgiving. The loyal housemaid squeezed Mary's hand one last time before being escorted from the manor. "I'll find a way back to you," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael Johnson faced similar retribution. Jennifer threatened to send him away from the stables, claiming his influence was corrupting Mary. The 12-year-old boy stood his ground, though his voice trembled when confronted by the mistress of the house. "You can't separate us," Michael told Mary later that evening, as they met secretly behind the oak tree. "I promised I'd help you see the world, even if you can't see it with your eyes." John Brown faced the most serious consequences. The Loki constable arrived at the manor, questioning him about interfering in family matters and practicing medicine without proper credentials. Jennifer had filed formal complaints, leveraging her connections in the village to turn opinion against him. "This isn't over," John told Mary before departing. "Your mother entrusted you to me, and I won't abandon that promise." But Mary's courage had sparked something unexpected. Her public confrontation had caught the attention of a magistrate who had known her father. Questions began to surface about Mary's guardianship and the management of her inheritance. Official inquiries were opened, documents requested, testimonies taken. The tension culminated in a final confrontation in the manor's parlor. Jennifer paced nervously as officials reviewed paperwork. Mary sat quietly, fingers tracing patterns on her dress. Then, without warning, she began to recite in a clear, steady voice. "When darkness falls and light seems gone, remember truth lives on and on. The key is hidden where music plays. A guardian comes through stormy days." The room fell silent. Jennifer's teacup clattered to the floor. "Those are my mother's words," Mary said. "From her final letter, the one you burned, stepmother. But you couldn't burn the words from my memory." The magistrate turned to Jennifer. "Is this true?" Jennifer's composure crumbled entirely. "How could you possibly know that?" she demanded of Mary, forgetting herself. "No one ever saw that letter except you," Mary finished. "Mother read it to me the night before she died. She knew what might happen." Jennifer sank into a chair, her carefully constructed facade finally shattering. The truth about Mary's inheritance, her medical condition, and her rightful guardian could no longer be hidden in shadows. The faded note from the attic and the intricate engravings on Mary Smith's music box formed an unexpected map. John Brown traced his finger along the pattern, his eyes widening with realization. "It's pointing to the family crypt," he whispered. Mary nodded, her fingers already memorizing the path they would need to take. Under the cover of night, John and Mary made their way across the dew-dampened grounds. The millionaire kept his goddaughter close, describing their surroundings in hushed tones as they approached the stone structure. "Your mother knew this day might come," he explained, producing an old key that matched the one etched on the music box. Inside the crypt, cold air clung to their skin as John guided Mary past marble monuments of her ancestors. "3 steps forward, then left," she instructed, recalling the pattern from the box. Her heightened senses detected a hollow sound beneath a particular stone. John moved it aside, revealing a waterproof case containing medical files and legal documents. By lantern light, he examined the papers, his expression hardening. "Jennifer falsified your diagnosis," he said, voice tight with controlled anger. "These records show your condition is treatable with proper care. Care she deliberately withheld." The documents also contained her mother's will, naming John as Mary's legal guardian should anything happen to her. Sarah Davis waited anxiously at the manor's kitchen door, ushering them inside when they returned. The loyal housemaid had prepared hot tea, wrapping a blanket around Mary's shoulders. "Did you find what you needed?" she asked, her concern evident in every gesture. "More than enough," John replied, his determination unwavering. The following morning, Jennifer Smith found herself confronted by not only John, but a solicitor and the family doctor. The evidence was irrefutable. She had manipulated Mary's condition to maintain control of the estate. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms as the legal consequences of her actions became clear. As the spring blossoms appeared and Mary's 9th birthday approached, the estate underwent a transformation. The deed reverted to her name, as stipulated in her mother's will. John established himself as her guardian, bringing in specialists who confirmed what he had suspected. With proper treatment, Mary might regain partial sight. Michael Johnson, the stable boy who had remained Mary's steadfast friend, helped Sarah decorate the manor for Mary's birthday celebration. Windows that had remained shuttered for years were thrown open, allowing sunlight to pour across polished floors. "This is just the beginning," John told Mary as she explored her changing home, fingers trailing along walls that no longer felt like a prison. The manor, once a place of shadows and secrets, was becoming a sanctuary where healing could finally begin. The spring sun filtered through the manor windows, casting golden patterns across the polished floors where Mary Smith sat at her mother's piano. Though she would never fully regain her sight, the darkness that had once terrified her now felt like an old companion. Her fingers danced across the ivory keys, creating melodies that seemed to capture both sorrow and joy in equal measure. "That's beautiful," John Brown remarked, his voice warm with pride as he entered the music room. "Your mother would have loved it." Mary smiled, the expression lighting up her face. At 9 years old, she had grown both in stature and spirit since that rainy day when her world had first gone dark. "I can almost see the notes in my mind," she explained, continuing to play. "They have colors." The estate had transformed in the months since the truth had been revealed. Jennifer Smith had departed after the legal proceedings, leaving behind the cold shadows she had cast over the manor. In her place, warmth and laughter had returned to the ancient halls. Sarah Davis moved about the house freely now, no longer a servant, but the estate's housekeeper and Mary's devoted guardian. She had arranged fresh flowers in every room, their scents creating a map that Mary could navigate by memory and smell alone. "Your birthday guests will arrive within the hour," Sarah reminded her, adjusting a vase of spring blooms. "Michael has already decorated the garden pavilion." Outside, Michael Johnson whistled as he hung paper lanterns from the oak trees. No longer just a stable boy, he had become the groundskeeper's apprentice, his dreams of adventure temporarily set aside for something he'd found more valuable: belonging. That evening, as twilight settled over the estate, Mary played her newest composition for the gathered guests. Her fingers found each note with perfect precision, the music telling the story of her journey from darkness into a different kind of light. "I may not see with my eyes," Mary told the assembled friends afterward, her voice clear and confident, "but I've learned to see with my heart." John stood nearby, no longer the mysterious millionaire, but the godfather who had kept his promise to her mother. The prototype device might have been lost in the greenhouse fire, but what they had discovered together was far more valuable: courage that transcended physical limitations. As the party continued around her, Mary traced the familiar contours of her mother's pocket watch, its steady ticking a reminder that time moved forward, even through the darkest nights. The music box sat on her bedside table now, its hidden map no longer secret, but a testament to the journey they had all taken together. In the end, Mary had found something greater than sight. She had found her voice, her family, and her place in a world that had once seemed determined to keep her invisible.